the way technology is. But that doesn't mitigate the fact that overwhelmingly the polymerase chain reaction works, and it proved to be the smoking gun evidence, as you know, for Bill Clinton. So the same argument in the broader philosophical context, when you look at the philosophy of science, applies to all the dating methods. If you take the science seriously, if you trust the scientists to the extent that I trust any scientist, it's still overwhelming that radiometric dating works, and the Earth is an awful lot older than 6,000 years. One final comment I want to make with regard to radiometric dating. As I mentioned to you, I'm an evolutionary biologist, a geneticist. I'm not a geophysicist. Kent is a science educator. His degree is in science education. To my knowledge, he does not publish scientific papers. Is that right? Do you publish scientific papers? Do you work in the laboratory, or?
The question is, have I published scientific papers?
Yeah. Do you work in the laboratory? Have you?
Oh, no, sir, no.
Yeah. In my case, if you take what I say about radiometric dating, you should take it with the understanding that it's coming from someone who looks at it at a secondary level, and the same would be true for Kent, that in effect you're listening to two charlatans talking about an aspect of science that neither of us knows in sufficient detail to really be talking about it like this. At that point, I want to return in the few minutes I have left. We keep wandering away from my efforts to find something within the book of Genesis that would lead to a testable prediction. And what I'm thinking is, I hope I'm not beating a dead horse or a dead dinosaur, so to speak, but I want to return to this idea of what a kind is, because, again, if we could determine what that is, and if we are willing to concede that microevolution occurs, which would allow some diversification within kinds, we could actually do a survey of the animal or plant kingdoms, or the bacterial kingdoms for that matter, and we could determine whether the genetic diversity between kinds, between species, within species, was consistent with the prediction that we derive from the Genesis hypothesis, and therefore we could test it. So I have to return to this. And before I do, if you'll just hold that thought and try to respond to that. Another test that comes to mind concerns genetic diversity. There's a well-known phenomenon in population genetics and evolutionary biology that when a population is reduced to a small size, that much of the genetic variation in the population is lost. And this is thought to be the explanation of the very low genetic diversity among cheetahs, and you can do experiments in the laboratory with Drosophila that demonstrate this very clearly. It is the case, and Genesis is fairly clear about this, that in the flood of Noah, that species pairs were put on the ark 2 by 2. Actually, there's a distinction between clean animals and unclean animals, and I'm not sure what that is, but unclean animals were brought on 2 by 2, and yes, clean animals, I think in pairs of 7 or 6 or something. I don't remember exactly. And that with regard to the human population or human sample on the ark, there was Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. Now, this is a population bottleneck, which according to the Genesis hypothesis occurred 4,000 years ago. And among other things, it would mean that there was only a single Y chromosome, that is Noah's male sex-determining chromosome. And I haven't done the calculations exactly, but we could. I mean, we could actually test this hypothesis. We could calculate how much genetic diversity there should be in modern populations, applying the uniformitarian principle of science, which I claim is essential if you're doing science, which would be to base it on mutation rates that we measure in the laboratory. And we could calculate what the genetic diversity of human populations ought to be. And where we want to look first, as I said, is at the Y chromosome, then the mitochondrial genome, because it's transmitted only through the females. We'd have even a smaller bottleneck there. And then we would want to look at the nuclear genes. But I claim, without having the data in hand, that the genetic diversity in human populations vastly exceeds a bottleneck of that sort. If we had really gone through the Noakan bottleneck, then heart transplants would not be near the problem they are today. The problem with all tissue transplants, heart transplants, liver transplants, has to do with the enormous diversity of the major histocompatibility genes. There are more histocompatibility alleles then it seems plausible could have come through that bottleneck. And not only that, there are histocompatibility genes within humans that are more similar to histocompatibility genes within gorillas than they are to other histocompatibility genes in humans. There's this enormous diversity, and I don't understand how that could have come through the bottleneck of that size. So I want you to address the problem of defining kinds such that we can look at how genetic diversity ought to be partitioned between kind species and within species, and then address this problem of the seemingly excessive genetic variation.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that. We've got quite a few questions that come in, right?
Yeah, if you don't mind, we appreciate all that you all have done, and we all enjoyed it very much. Maybe we give them all a big hand. If you would take just a moment, Dr. Hovind, to respond, and then I have a few questions from the audience. What I would ask in advance is, in an effort to get some questions through, if you could keep your responses, both of you, down to about 3 minutes, so we can get a few questions through. I'd certainly appreciate it. And for the audience, we'd appreciate it if you'd hold your response until the end to give us optimal time for these questions. Thank you.
Okay, you asked what is a kind. I've told you several times I don't know for sure. If I had to pick something, I guess I would say it's closer to our current divisions of family as opposed to species. You've never given a definition of species, and you made a big deal about you have made a big deal about making predictions, yet the evolutionists do not make predictions. I will give you some predictions based on the Genesis account. I would predict that because of this worldwide flood, we should find